if you were arrested in Edo period Japan, I mean, the police definitely didn't read your rights.
No, absolutely not.
And they didn't just, click a pair of metal handcuffs over your wrists either.
Right. It was a completely different world.
Instead, they deployed this highly coordinated, just terrifyingly effective system of non-lethal violence.
Very, very calibrated violence.
Exactly. I mean, they used these weaponized lint rollers designed to shred and entangle your clothing.
Which is such a crazy visual.
It is. And they used these long poles completely covered in jagged iron spikes just to pin your neck against a wall.
Ah.
And then, once you were on the ground, they bound you using this fiercely guarded, incredibly complex mathematical knot system.
Right, the rope tying.
Yeah, and it acted as this sort of visual barcode telling the entire city exactly what social class you belonged to while you were basically slowly suffocating in the dirt.
It really was an ecosystem of control.
It was.
I mean, a complete physical manifestation of a society's legal code, just translated into extreme violence.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are exploring this massive stack of sources, translated Edo period combat logs, museum exhibit guides, treatises on ancient Japanese law, and some really old classical martial arts manuals.
It's a fantastic stack of material today.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the mission for this deep dive is to look at the reality of torite jutsu.
Which roughly translates to arresting techniques.
Right. And when we look at the actual mechanical foundation for so many of the modern martial arts practiced around the world today, things like, Jujutsu and Judo.
Yeah, the arts a lot of people practice right now.
Exactly. They absolutely were not forged in quiet dojos by monks meditating on cherry blossom.
Not even close. I mean, they were engineered on execution grounds.
Yeah.
And in the really crowded, dangerous alleyways of Edo, they were born out of this desperate, bloody necessity to arrest highly trained, heavily armed criminals alive.
Alive being the key word there.
Yes.
So, to understand how a whole nation completely rewrites the physical technology of violence, I feel like we have to look at the massive historical paradigm shift that made torite jutsu necessary in the first place, right?
We definitely do.
Because the story doesn't start in the police stations of Edo.
No, it starts in the mud.
In the mud of the Sengoku period.
Right. So the Sengoku period, or the Age of Warring States, it spanned from the late 15th to the late 16th century.
Just a really long time.
It was a century of nearly uninterrupted, catastrophic civil war.
Wow.
Yeah. The Japanese islands were fractured, completely dominated by these regional warlords called daimyo, and they were all just fighting for ultimate supremacy.
So it was just constant chaos for everyone.
Constant. And for the samurai class, the environment was purely binary.
Meaning what, exactly?
Well, meaning you were on a chaotic, blood-soaked battlefield, and your only objective was to eliminate the enemy in front of you before they eliminated you.
Kill or be killed.
Exactly. And the sources go into intense detail about the physical reality of that battlefield.
Right, because we have to strip away that cinematic illusion you see in movies, where it's two samurai having this clean, elegant sword duel.
Oh, yeah. The reality was nothing like the movies.
These men were encased in yoroi, right? That heavy Japanese armor.
Yes, yoroi. And it was made of overlapping plates of iron and leather, laced together with thick silk.
And they were carrying heavy weapons, fighting in the rain, in the dirt, surrounded by thousands of other men.
Right. And the thing you have to realize is, when you are facing an opponent clad in 50 pounds of interlocking iron and leather plates, a sword is practically useless as a slashing weapon.
Wait, really? Because you always picture them just slicing through things.
Not against that armor. If you swing a katana at a man wearing yoroi, the blade will either bounce right off, it'll shatter, or it'll just get helplessly notched in the iron.
Oh, wow.
The geometry of a slashing attack simply fails against that metallurgical barrier.
Okay, which means the combat inevitably breaks down into something much more visceral.
Much more intimate and brutal.
Because the sources describe the primary battlefield methodology of this era as kumiuchi, right?
Yes, kumiuchi, which translates to battlefield grappling.
So it's basically two armored men crashing into each other.
Exactly. You have two heavy masses colliding. The physics of kumiuchi revolve entirely around displacing the opponent's center of gravity.
Like wrestling, but in heavy iron.
Right. You are gripping the structural points of their armor using trips, reaps, and massive weight displacement to drag this ironclad human being down into the mud.
And once you drag them down, the sources show this rapid transition to the next phase, which is called kogusoku.
The short dagger techniques.
Right.
Because once you have neutralized the opponent's mobility by pinning them to the ground, your entire biomechanical focus shrinks down to finding a gap of exposed flesh of maybe 2 or 3 inches.
Which is just terrifying to think about. You're wrestling in the mud and you're trying to pry open an armpit, or maybe the inside of the thigh, or the shikoro.
The shikoro, yes, the heavy neck guard attached to the helmet.
So you're literally fighting the armor itself.
You are fighting the suspension system of the armor. You're prying it back just far enough to drive a short blade into an artery.
It's just pure pragmatic lethality.
Completely. The code of combat is zero-sum.
But then that zero-sum world just disappears almost overnight, right?
It does. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu unifies Japan, establishes the Tokugawa Shogunate, and initiates the Edo period.
Right. We go from a century of apocalyptic civil war to this period of strictly governed, totally totalitarian peace that lasts for over 250 years.
Which creates a massive sociological problem.
Because what do you do with all the soldiers?
Exactly. You suddenly have an enormous population of professional warriors, the samurai, who have absolutely no war to fight.
Their entire purpose is just gone.
Their entire technology of killing is rendered obsolete by peace. So, to survive, the samurai class has to pivot.
They become bureaucrats.
Right. Bureaucrats, tax collectors, administrators, and crucially, they become the police force of the new Tokugawa regime.
And this is where the rules of engagement hit this massive legal wall. Because under the new Tokugawa legal architecture, you couldn't just execute a suspect on the street anymore.
No. The state demanded a total monopoly on lethal violence.
Right. They wanted absolute control.
The authorities recognized that random street executions would just lead to chaos and blood feuds, and that would destroy the fragile peace they had literally just established.
So what was the rule?
The law required that criminals, even highly dangerous armed criminals, had to be captured alive.
Alive.
Yes. They had to be brought in, subjected to formal interrogation, forced to sign a confession, face a magistrate's trial, and then, only if they were found guilty, would they face official punishment at designated state-run execution grounds, like Kozukapara.
So the overarching goal just completely flips.
Entirely.
If you are a guard or a police officer in the Edo period, you are facing an opponent who is actively trying to kill you, but you are legally mandated to keep them alive.
It's a terrifying legal puzzle.
And that legal puzzle forces the rapid evolution from the lethal battlefield grappling of kogusoku to the non-lethal arresting arts of torite jutsu.
Exactly. It requires a fundamental rewiring of combat geometry.
How so?
Well, on the Sengoku battlefield, the physical focus was targeting the vascular system, right? Finding an artery to bleed out the opponent.
Right.
But in the streets of Edo, the focus shifts entirely to the skeletal and nervous systems. The physics become all about leverage.
Manipulating the joints.
Yes. How do you apply localized pressure to a joint to create excruciating pain and force physical compliance without actually severing the life force?
See, I am looking at the translation of one of the early Edo period combat logs that we have on the table right now, and I have a serious problem with how this narrative is often presented today.
You mean the gentle art concept?
Exactly. Over the centuries, arts derived from these practices, like jujutsu, have inherited this moniker of the gentle art. But reading these translated manuals, I mean, there is absolutely nothing gentle happening here.
Oh, the translation of in jujutsu as gentle is one of the most persistent mistranslations in martial arts history.
It really feels like it.
Yielding or pliable is much closer to the truth, but honestly, even that obscures the violence.
Because look at this specific list of techniques for a street arrest from the source. The manual dictates systematic bone breaking, tearing the rotator cuff, gouging the eyes to cause permanent blindness, snapping the knee ligaments, and collapsing the windpipe.
It is incredibly brutal.
I'm really struggling to reconcile this. If the strict legal objective of the shogunate was to keep the suspect alive for trial, why are the state-sanctioned manuals outlining a methodology that is so incredibly surgically violent?
To reconcile that, you really have to look at the brutal mathematical reality the Edo police were facing.
Okay, break that down for me.
We have to separate the concept of alive from the concept of unharmed.
Oh.
The Tokugawa law demanded the suspect be alive. It cared very little about the structural integrity of the suspect's limbs.
So alive, but not necessarily intact.
Precisely. I mean, put yourself in the sandals of an Edo police officer. You are tasked with arresting a ronin, a masterless samurai.
Who is heavily armed.
Right. This is a man who is trained in swordsmanship since childhood. He is wielding a katana, a weapon forged from high-carbon steel that is capable of severing a human torso in a single swing.
Yeah, a terrifying weapon.
And he is desperate. He knows a death sentence awaits him if captured, and he is fully prepared to cut you to pieces.
So if you try to tackle him gently, you just die.
You die immediately. The margin of error is literally zero.
Wow.
Unarmed torite jutsu was born out of this terrifying imbalance of power. You have to subdue this armed, resisting human being without dealing a lethal blow to their core.
So what's the solution?
The most mechanically efficient way to ensure a man cannot swing a 3-foot razor blade at your neck is to permanently destroy the fulcrum that allows his arm to move.
You attack the elbow.
You shatter the elbow. The techniques you're reading about, tearing the rotator cuff, snapping the radial bone, these aren't acts of sadistic torture. They are biomechanical disarmament.
That makes so much sense when you put it like that.
Right. If you dislocate a swordsman's shoulder or hyperextend his knee until the ligaments tear, you instantly neutralize the threat.
The suspect cannot fight back.
Exactly. They cannot run. But crucially, their vital organs are completely untouched. Their heart is pumping.
The legal requirement is fulfilled.
Yes. They are alive for interrogation.
So the violence is extreme, but it acts as a firewall. You are systematically dismantling the peripheral limbs to protect the central core.
And this surgical dismantling required a level of anatomical knowledge that battlefield soldiers never needed.
Because you have to know exactly how it all connects.
Yes. This is why the sources show that the development of torite jutsu was intimately linked with the study of kappo,
Capo.
traditional methods of resuscitation and bone setting.
Wait, so the police officers breaking the bones were also the ones studying how to set them?
In many cases, yes. The martial arts schools of the era were essentially laboratories of human anatomy.
That is fascinating.
To know exactly how much torque is required to separate a shoulder joint, you have to understand the entire architecture of the joint.
You had to know how to take the body apart efficiently.
Yes, and often you had to know the rudimentary medical techniques to keep a severely injured, bleeding suspect from going into shock and dying in the holding cell before their trial.
Because if they died in the cell, you, the arresting officer, failed your mandate.
Exactly, you broke the law.
Though, looking at the historical accounts of the Edo prison system in our sources, surviving the arrest was hardly a comfort.
Oh no.
The holding cells were notoriously brutal, disease-ridden wooden cages. I mean, many criminals succumbed to the elements or infection long before seeing a magistrate.
The system had no interest in the comfort or rehabilitation of the prisoner. The shogunate's objective was entirely about optics and absolute control.
So they didn't actually care about the criminal's well-being.
Not at all. The state, and only the state, was permitted to decide when a life ended.
Wow. So we have the theory of the arrest down. The objective is to use intense, localized structural damage to capture a suspect without killing them.
Right.
But theory is one thing. Walking down a dark alley to confront a desperate swordsman with your bare hands is practically suicide.
It is suicide.
So how did the police actually execute these arrests without suffering massive casualties?
Well, what's fascinating here is they rarely relied on bare-handed techniques as a first resort. Unarmed torite jutsu was the failsafe.
The backup plan.
Exactly. The true genius of the Edo law enforcement apparatus lay in their defensive engineering, specifically an arsenal of specialized non-lethal polearms.
Right, the Torimono Mitsudogu.
The 3 arresting tools. These instruments are just a masterclass in utilizing distance and geometry to solve the puzzle of a bladed weapon.
Let's walk through the exact mechanics of these tools, because the museum exhibit guides we have here contain some incredibly detailed schematics.
They are brilliant designs.
We should start with the foundation of the trio, the sasumata.
Yes, the sasumata. It is essentially a thick wooden pole, roughly 2 meters long. And at the working end, it is fitted with a heavy iron head shaped like a wide U or a 2-pronged fork.
And the inside curve of that U-shape is completely lined with these vicious, inward-pointing iron spikes.
Right. The operational physics of the sasumata are all about pinning the center of mass.
Okay.
If a suspect is swinging a sword, you use the 2-meter reach of the pole to stay entirely outside the cutting radius of their blade.
So you're safe.
You thrust the heavy iron fork directly at the suspect's throat, their torso, or the crux of their limbs, and you use the leverage of the long shaft to drive them backward.
Pinning them forcefully against a wall or down into the dirt.
Exactly. And the spikes aren't there to impale the suspect.
Right. The sources say they're there to grip the clothing and flesh just enough so the suspect can't slip out of the U-shape once pressure is applied.
It's all about friction.
What's incredible is how timeless this specific biomechanical solution is.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, if you walk into a school, a bank, or a train station in Japan today, you will often find modern, lightweight aluminum versions of the sasumata mounted on the wall.
It's true. They are still actively used by police and security personnel to pin down aggressive individuals.
Because the physics of keeping an armed attacker at a safe distance while neutralizing their mobility haven't changed in 400 years.
Physics is physics. But the Edo police rarely used the sasumata in isolation. It was part of a layered system.
Right, they work together.
Yes. And the second tool in the Torimono Mitsudogu is arguably the most terrifyingly inventive, the sodegarami.
The sleeve entangler.
Exactly. The sodegarami is also a long pole, but instead of a fork, the iron head is this dense cluster of barbed hooks and jagged spikes pointing in every conceivable direction.
I was staring at the illustrations of the sodegarami in the sources, trying to find a modern equivalent to explain how it functions, and honestly, the best way to describe it is a medieval weaponized lint roller.
That is a remarkably accurate metaphor.
It just looks like it rolls up everything it touches.
Yes. And the design is entirely dependent on exploiting the fashion of the Edo period.
Right, because everyone, samurai, merchants, commoners, they all wore variations of the kimono or the yukata.
Correct. And these garments featured thick, durable fabrics and incredibly wide flowing sleeves.
So the wide sleeve of the kimono is the primary target.
Yes. The officer wielding the sodegarami does not aim for the suspect's flesh. They thrust that heavy spiked head directly into the billowing fabric of the sleeve.
And the moment the barbs catch the durable cotton or silk, the officer just violently twists the shaft of the pole.
The physics of the torsion take over. As the pole spins, it winds the heavy fabric around the spiked head, tightening the kimono incredibly fast.
It acts as a localized straitjacket.
That's exactly what it is.
The tightening fabric violently pulls the suspect's arm outward and off balance.
And think about it. If they are holding a sword, the tension in the sleeve completely immobilizes their shoulder and elbow.
Stripping them of the leverage required to swing the weapon.
Right. They're literally defeated by their own clothing.
You're using the tension of their garment to bind their joints. It is a brilliant, just terrifying exploitation of the cultural environment.
It is defensive genius.
Yeah.
And to complete the trio, you have the tsukubo.
The pushing pole.
Yes. This was a long shaft fitted with a T-shaped iron crossbar, which was also heavily spiked.
This seems to be the blunt instrument of the three, right? Like, if the sasumata pins the neck and the sodegarami twists the sleeves, the tsukubo is used to just shove the suspect.
It was about maintaining spatial dominance. You use the heavy T-bar to strike the suspect's shins, sweep their legs out from under them, or simply shove them backward onto the ground.
Ensuring they never get the footing required to mount an offensive strike.
Exactly.
Now, looking at the schematics of all three of these poles, there is a very specific design feature they all share, which highlights just how meticulously the police studied sword combat.
You're talking about the upper shaft.
Yeah. The top 2 to 3 feet of the wooden shaft, just below the iron heads, they are not bare wood. They are wrapped in heavy iron strips and studded with hundreds of sharp metal rivets.
This is the peak of their defensive engineering. Because consider the natural reaction of a highly trained samurai when a guard thrusts a wooden pole at them.
Right. The samurai is going to step off the center line, parry the pole, grab the wooden shaft with their free hand, pull the guard forward, and cut their head off.
Exactly. Or they'll just use the superior edge of the katana to hack the wooden pole in half.
Which would be disastrous for the guard.
Completely. So the iron strips prevent the katana from severing the wood.
And the hundreds of sharp rivets make the top corner of the weapon entirely ungrabbable.
Right. If the suspect tries to seize the pole to pull the officer in, they will literally shred the tendons in their own hands.
So the design ensures the police officer maintains absolute control of the weapon and the distance.
Yes. But these long poles weren't the only tools. The sources dedicate significant time to a much smaller but culturally massive weapon, the jitte.
The jitte is probably the most iconic symbol of Edo-period law enforcement.
It is.
It is a heavy metal truncheon, usually forged from iron, ranging from 12 to 18 inches in length. And its defining feature is a single thick metal prong that curves upward from the handle guard, running parallel to the main shaft for a few inches.
Now, a lot of modern pop culture depicts the jitte as a tool for catching and snapping a sword blade.
Yeah, you see that in movies all the time. But while the sources confirm the prong could be used to trap a katana, deliberately trying to catch a razor-sharp blade swing at full speed with a 1-inch gap of iron seems like an incredibly low percentage move.
It was highly dangerous, though technically possible. The high-carbon steel of a Japanese sword is incredibly sharp, but it is also quite brittle along the flat side of the blade.
Right, because of how it's tempered.
Exactly. If an expert officer successfully trapped the blade in the prong of the jitte and applied extreme lateral torque, they could snap the sword in half.
But the primary combative use of the jitte was much simpler than that, wasn't it?
Oh yes, it was a dense bar of iron used to strike the suspect's wrists, collarbones, and skull.
It was a blunt force trauma instrument designed to shatter the bones of the sword arm.
Precisely. But the sources emphasized that the jitte was much more than just a bludgeon. It was a physical manifestation of authority.
Meaning it was basically a badge.
The jitte functioned as the Edo equivalent of a modern police badge, yes.
So the craftsmanship of the weapon, the type of metal used, the intricate wrappings on the handle, and the color of the silk tassels attached to a ring at the base, all of these elements served as a highly visible ranking system.
Exactly. When an officer drew a jitte, they were visually projecting their specific rank, their jurisdiction, and their legal authority to enact violence on behalf of the shogunate.
Which brings us to the actual operators of these tools. Who was walking the streets of Edo carrying these jitte and spiked poles?
Well, the law enforcement hierarchy of the Tokugawa shogunate was incredibly complex, but the street-level violence was primarily handled by two distinct groups.
Let's look at the elite force first, the Hitsuki Tozoku Aratami.
Yes, the Hitsuki Aratami translates roughly to the arson and theft investigative force.
Which sounds kind of mundane, honestly.
But that title dramatically undersells their authority. In the context of Ego, which was a massive, densely populated city built almost entirely of wood and paper, arson wasn't just a crime.
It was an act of mass terrorism.
Exactly. A single fire could, and often did, incinerate entire districts, killing thousands of people.
So the men tasked with stopping arsonists weren't just standard beat cops.
They were an elite, heavily armed paramilitary unit. They operated outside the standard jurisdiction of the local magistrates.
Wow.
The officers of the Hitsuki Tozoku Aratami were seasoned samurai, intensely trained in swordsmanship, torite jutsu, and the coordinated deployment of the arresting poles.
They were deployed to hunt down the most violent, organized criminal gangs and murderers in the city.
They were the Edo-period SWAT team.
A highly accurate comparison. They dealt with the threats that standard patrols just could not handle.
But below the elite samurai, you had a much grittier, much more morally ambiguous layer of law enforcement, the Okapiki.
The Okapiki represent the pragmatic reality of policing a massive urban center, don't they?
They do. Because high-ranking samurai officials were bound by strict protocols of honor and class. They could not easily infiltrate the seedy underworld of gambling dens, brothels, and taverns.
So they needed proxies.
Enter the Okapiki.
The sources describe them as unofficial police assistants. They were commoners, often shopkeepers or laborers, but very frequently they were former criminals themselves.
They were the ultimate street-level informants.
The government essentially deputized men who already knew the criminal networks because they used to run in them.
Exactly. And they weren't paid a regular salary by the state. They operated on a system of bounties and unofficial stipends from the samurai magistrates they reported to.
So they were handed a jitte and a coil of rope and basically told to keep the streets quiet. It's a fascinatingly corrupt but effective system.
It was incredibly effective. The Okapiki had their ears to the ground. When a violent crime occurred, it was usually the Okapiki who tracked down the suspect's location, gathered the local patrolmen, and initiated the arrest.
And the historical accounts of how these groups executed an arrest are just terrifying in their mechanical precision.
It was a very well-oiled machine.
Let's walk through the geometry of one of these street encounters based on the tactical logs in our sources. Let's say the Okapiki have tracked a wanted, heavily armed swordsman to a narrow alleyway in Edo. They don't just kick the door down and rush him one by one.
Rushing a master swordsman is an invitation to a massacre.
Right.
The arresting unit operates like a pack of wolves hunting a larger predator. They rely entirely on coordination, environmental control, and the layering of their tools.
The first thing they bring in aren't even the weapons. The logs show they heavily utilized heavy wooden ladders.
The ladders serve as mobile barricades.
Oh, that makes sense.
When the swordsman draws his blade, he expects a duel. Instead, 6 or 7 men converge on him, and the men at the front are holding these heavy wooden ladders vertically, slowly advancing.
you're boxing him in. And if he swings the katana, the blade just bites harmlessly into the thick wooden rungs of the ladder.
Exactly. The ladders absorb the lethal potential of the sword and compress the suspect's spatial awareness.
So as the ladders push forward, shrinking the arena, the officers wielding the Torimono Mitsudogu strike from the flanks, reaching over and around the ladders.
The choreography of violence begins.
Yeah. From the left, an officer thrusts the sodegarami, the barbed head burying into the wide sleeve of the suspect's kimono. He violently twists the pole, the fabric tightening instantly, ripping the suspect's left shoulder forward and completely locking the arm.
The suspect tries to cut the pole, but the blade deflects off the iron strips.
Right, the defensive engineering we talked about.
And before he can recover his balance, a second officer from the right drives the massive, heavy fork of the sasumata directly into the suspect's neck, pinning him backward against the alley wall.
The iron spikes bite into the collar of his clothing, holding him fast.
He is now pinned by the neck and immobilized by his own sleeve. The leverage of a sword swing is gone.
Finally, a third officer uses the T-bar of the tsukubo to smash the back of his knees, collapsing as structural support.
He crashes into the dirt. The swordsman is pinned under the weight of multiple heavy poles, his weapon neutralized.
The mechanics of the takedown are flawless. But this brings us to the next critical and arguably most psychologically devastating phase of the operation.
Securing the prisoner.
Right. The suspect is pinned to the ground, the threat of the sword is gone, but you can't just stand there holding him against the dirt with a pole all day. You have to secure him for transport.
This is where we transition from the gross motor violence of the poles to the highly secretive, fine motor precision of Hojojutsu.
Also known as Torimono Mitsudogu, right?
Yes, the traditional Japanese art of rope tying.
Now, to a modern listener, tying up a prisoner seems like a purely utilitarian function. You put their hands behind their back, you wrap some rope around the wrists, you tie a knot, and you walk them to jail.
But the sources reveal that Hojojutsu was a fiercely guarded, incredibly sophisticated martial science in its own right.
It was a whole curriculum.
It was a curriculum that officers spent years mastering, memorizing dozens of complex mathematical knot patterns that had to be deployed rapidly.
Because you are dealing with a resisting, thrashing human being who still wants to kill you.
Absolutely. The logs emphasize that an officer had to be able to apply these complex geometric restraints in a matter of seconds.
In the pitch black of a rainy night, often relying entirely on tactile feedback without looking at their hands.
The engineering of the restraints is fascinating. The ropes were not just loops, they were interwoven pathways designed to exploit the human nervous and respiratory systems.
That sounds diabolical.
Many of the arresting ties involve running the rope around the neck, down the spine, and under the armpits in a continuous circuit that connected to the bound wrists.
I see the diagrams here in the sources. The way the rope crosses the chest and ties back to the neck, it's a mechanical trap.
It creates a biofeedback loop of pain.
How does that work?
If the suspect remains perfectly calm and submissive, keeping their head bowed and their shoulders relaxed, the ropes hold them securely but relatively comfortably.
Okay, so if they comply, they're okay.
However, the exact moment the suspect attempts to struggle, stand up straight, or pull their arms apart, the geometry of the knots tightens instantly.
The struggle triggers the trap. The rope bites into the pressure points under the arms and constricts the trachea.
Exactly. Even the act of heavy, panicked breathing works against the suspect.
Seriously, just breathing.
The loops around the chest are tied in a way that allows the chest to expand when inhaling, but as the suspect exhales, the knot mechanically slips and tightens.
Oh my God.
With every breath, the cage of rope shrinks, slowly suffocating them if they continue to resist. It forces absolute, agonizing compliance.
But the most stunning aspect of Hojojutsu isn't the biomechanics, it's the sociology.
Oh, this is the most intriguing part.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I was reading through the specific curriculum of several different tying schools detailed in the museum guides, and a deeply unsettling pattern emerges.
Yes, the class system.
Right. The entire system of Hojojutsu was intimately, inextricably tied to the rigid class structures of Edo society.
It was a physical manifestation of Tokugawa law.
The records state that the police possessed massive catalogs of different tying methods, and the exact method utilized depended entirely on the social status, the gender, and the profession of the suspect.
Yeah.
They used completely different colors of rope, different thicknesses of cord, and entirely different geometric knot patterns to bind a samurai than they did a commoner.
That is correct. Even the anatomy of the knots themselves changed based on who was being tied.
A merchant had a specific knot. A Buddhist monk had a specific knot. A woman had a specific knot.
Exactly.
And looking at this from a modern perspective, I have a massive logical disconnect here. Why on earth would a police force, in the middle of a violent, chaotic street arrest, care about the color or thickness of the rope? If a samurai and a peasant both commit murder, they are both criminals. They are both facing the executioner. Shouldn't the social status of the murderer be completely irrelevant at the moment of arrest?
Well, that is a very modern, egalitarian view of justice.
Right, because we think everyone is equal under the law.
The idea that justice is blind, that the law applies equally to all regardless of status, did not exist in Tokugawa Japan. To understand Hojojutsu, you have to understand the existential terror the shogunate held towards social mobility.
The strict enforcement of the class system.
Yes, the system was known as Shinokosho. It rigidly divided society into 4 absolute tiers. Samurai at the top, followed by peasants, artisans, and merchants at the bottom.
And this hierarchy wasn't just a social suggestion, it was divine law.
It dictated every aspect of existence. The style of roof you could put on your house, the colors of clothing you were legally permitted to wear, the food you could consume.
Everything was regulated.
Everything. The entire stability of the 250-year peace relied on everyone remaining exactly in their designated caste.
So even in the act of arresting someone, the state could not allow that hierarchy to blur.
Never. The visual broadcast of the class system had to be maintained at all times, even in the ultimate moment of disgrace.
So when a suspect was bound and marched through the crowded streets of Edo to the magistrate's office, the rope functioned as a societal barcode.
It told everyone on the street exactly who was being punished.
It communicated the exact parameters of the state's dominance.
Yes. If a samurai committed a crime and was arrested by an okapiki, a commoner informant, the state faced a paradox. A commoner was physically dominating a member of the ruling class.
Which undermines the whole system.
Exactly. To mitigate this disruption of the social order, the physical restraint itself had to acknowledge the samurai's superior status.
How does a rope show respect?
Through material and geometry. A samurai would rarely be bound with rough, abrasive hemp. The police might use a thinner, finer cord, perhaps made of silk.
Oh, wow.
The knot pattern applied to the samurai's back would be highly complex, aesthetically symmetrical, and crucially designed to allow the samurai to maintain a somewhat upright, dignified posture as he walked.
Because he's still a samurai.
Furthermore, the ropes were tied in a way that avoided crossing the chest or the neck in patterns that the samurai class considered the ultimate spiritual insult.
You are preserving a sliver of aristocratic honor even as you drag him to the holding cell.
Exactly. You are confirming that he is a criminal, but you are also confirming he is still a samurai.
Now contrast that with how they bound a common thief.
The sources show no such restraint there.
None. A commoner would be bound with thick, rough, utilitarian hemp rope.
Right. And the knot pattern was brutally constricting, deliberately designed to force the suspect's shoulders down and their head forward into a hunched, submissive, humiliating posture.
The rope physically forced them to bow to the society they had wronged.
That is an incredibly dark concept.
It is. The physical application of the law literally weaves the social hierarchy into the ropes binding the prisoner's flesh.
The rope wasn't just holding their wrists, it was holding the entire societal structure together.
Wow.
And the secrecy surrounding these knots was paramount. Different police precincts, different domains, and different martial arts schools all developed their own proprietary, heavily guarded tying methods.
Because the knot itself was a signature.
Precisely. If a body was found bound in an alley, or a prisoner was transferred between jurisdictions, a magistrate could look at the complex geometry of the knot on the suspect's back and know instantly which specific police unit or which specific martial arts school had executed the arrest.
The knot was a legal document written in rope. So if we step back, we have traced the entire terrifying sequence of an Edo period arrest. The suspect is cornered with the mobile barricades of ladders. Their mobility is systematically dismantled by the sasumata pinning the neck and the sodegarami twisting the sleeves.
They are brought to the ground by the tsukubo.
Subdued by the surgical joint destruction of torite jutsu. And finally, they are bound and cataloged using the class-based mathematical restraints of Hojojutsu.
It was a brutal, highly effective system of control. And it worked.
It allowed the Tokugawa Shogunate to maintain relative domestic peace in one of the most densely populated urban centers in the world for over 2.5 centuries.
But history doesn't stand still.
No, it doesn't. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration occurs. The Tokugawa Shogunate falls. The emperor is restored to power, the samurai class is completely abolished, and Japan begins to modernize and westernize at an absolutely breakneck speed.
The carrying of swords in public is outlawed.
The entire ecosystem that created these arresting arts just vanishes.
It completely evaporates.
Which leads us to the final and perhaps most impactful section of our deep dive, the legacy. How did these hyper-specific, terrifying police tactics solve the death of the samurai class?
That's a great question.
And how did the violence of the Edo streets morph into the martial arts practiced by millions of people globally today?
They survived through a process of unification and adaptation.
Okay, walk me through that.
During the Edo period, there were hundreds of different martial lineages known as ryuha, practicing variations of these techniques. They used a dizzying array of terminology: kumiuchi, kugusoku, torite, yawara, taijutsu.
Just so many different names for grappling and fighting.
Right. But as Japan modernized, the sources show a concerted effort to codify these surviving arts. Gradually, all of these disparate terms relating to unarmed and lightly armed combat were swept under a single, unifying umbrella term.
Jujutsu.
Yes, jujutsu, the art of yielding.
Now, when tracing the lineage of jujutsu back to its absolute roots, the historical texts in our source stack all point to a very specific, incredibly important school, Takenuchi-ryu.
Takenuchi-ryu is a historical monolith. It is almost universally recognized by martial historians as the oldest verifiable, continuously operating jujutsu school in Japan.
The lineage records dictate that it was founded in 1532 by a high-ranking warrior named Takenuchi Hisamori in Okayama.
Now, the date 1532 is crucial.
Why is that?
That places its founding squarely in the middle of the Sengoku period, the Age of Warring States, nearly 70 years before the Edo-period peace began.
Which is exactly why Takenuchi-ryu is so vital to our understanding of this evolution. While most samurai were focusing entirely on battlefield spear and sword tactics, Takenuchi Hisamori developed a comprehensive curriculum centered heavily on kokusoku, the short dagger grappling, and torite arresting techniques.
He essentially foresaw the need for a systematized method of close-quarters restraint long before the police forces of Edo made it a legal requirement.
That's incredible foresight.
It really is. The scrolls from Takenuchi-ryu detail the brutal reality of capturing an enemy, outlining the joint locks, the dagger thrusts, and the rope tying.
It was a complete curriculum of human survival, and it wasn't the only one of its kind emerging in that era. The sources highlight several other prominent schools established in the mid to late 1500s that were deeply rooted in arresting techniques, such as Araki-ryu Kempo, which specialized in arresting, and Tenka Musuryu.
These classical schools, these koryu, are fascinating because they didn't disappear.
You can travel to Japan today, find a traditional koryu dojo, and watch practitioners training in the exact same methodologies.
They are living time capsules.
They still train with the heavy iron sasumata, the barbed sodegarami, the jitte, and they still practice the complex geometric rope patterns of Hojojutsu.
They preserve the raw, unadulterated DNA of the Edo period arresting officer. However, the history of how these indigenous Japanese arts evolved into the broad concept of jujutsu is not without its controversies.
Right. This brings us to a massive historical debate present in our sources, which is absolutely fascinating. It's the debate over the true origin of jujutsu's biomechanical core. Was it purely Japanese, or was the code imported from the outside?
The Chinese origin theory versus the indigenous origin theory. This debate perfectly highlights how messy, politicized, and nationalistic martial arts history can become.
Let's lay out the narrative of the Chinese origin theory because it centers around a very specific historical figure.
According to certain Edo period records in the 1620s, a Ming dynasty scholar, poet, and martial artist named Chen Yuanbin fled the political collapse of China and arrived in Japan.
Chen Yuanbin was a highly educated man. He eventually settled as a guest at the Kokushoji Temple in Edo.
And the legend, as recorded in several later texts, claims that while staying at this temple, Chen observed 3 masterless samurai ronin practicing their traditional martial arts in the courtyard.
The story goes that Chen stepped in and demonstrated that their techniques were flawed. He then supposedly taught them highly advanced Chinese grappling techniques, specifically methods of seizing an opponent, manipulating joints, and striking vital pressure points.
The narrative asserts that these 3 ronin took Chen Yuanbin's teachings, blended them with their existing Japanese knowledge, and went on to found their own respective martial arts schools.
And it is from these 3 schools that the mainstream branches of medieval Japanese jiu-jitsu supposedly evolved.
If you follow that historical thread, It suggests that the fundamental biomechanics of jujutsu, the joint locks, the yielding to force, the precise vital point strikes, aren't indigenous to Japan at all.
It implies that the core operating system of Japanese arresting arts was actually imported Chinese kenpo.
It is a compelling narrative, especially during eras when Japanese scholars were heavily influenced by Chinese philosophy and culture. However, the sources explicitly note that this theory has been fiercely debated and heavily rejected by many prominent Japanese historians and modern martial arts founders.
The most notable voice rejecting the Chen Yuanbin theory being Jigoro Kano, the founder of Judo.
Kano was a brilliant scholar as well as a martial artist. He studied the ancient texts meticulously. Kano repeatedly pointed to the indisputable historical timeline.
He pointed right back to Takenuchi Hisamori.
Kano asserted that Takenuchi-ryu, founded in 1532, was actively practicing, documenting, and teaching highly sophisticated grappling, arresting techniques, and joint locks nearly a full century before Chen Yuanbin ever set foot on Japanese soil.
Kano's argument, which is widely accepted by modern historians, is that while Chen Yuanbin may have introduced some novel concepts or philosophical frameworks to those specific ronin, the core mechanical foundation of jujutsu was already deeply established.
The grappling of kumiuchi, the dagger combat of kogusoku, and the joint manipulation of torite were 100% indigenous to the Japanese islands.
They were forged purely in the crucible of the Japanese battlefield and refined by the legal necessities of the Edo police force.
The debate itself is fascinating, but regardless of whether outside influences subtly shaped its later development, the reality remains that by the late 19th century, jujutsu was an incredibly effective, highly codified, and brutally pragmatic system of violence.
But it was still fundamentally a jujutsu. The word jutsu implies a technique, a pragmatic method of war. It was a tool designed to break humans.
Which brings us back to the modern era.
So what does this all mean? Does this mean that the ancient and spiritual martial arts practiced in clean, quiet gyms around the world are essentially just reverse-engineered police tactics from the Edo execution grounds?
Fundamentally, yes. The entire essence of modern grappling arts revolves around the exact mechanical truths discovered during this historical evolution.
So when a practitioner steps onto a tatami mat in London or New York or Tokyo, and they execute an armbar or a precise wrist lock or a pinning hold, wait, they're doing the same thing.
They are executing the exact same biomechanical math developed by the Hitsuke Tozoku Aratame to capture a swordsman alive.
Wow.
The context of the action has changed entirely, the social environment has changed, but the physics of the human skeleton have not.
Right, the amount of leverage required to hyperextend an elbow is exactly the same today as it was in 1650.
But the intent has changed. And that shift in intent is largely due to the monumental efforts of Jigoro Kano in the late 19th century.
He realized that the raw, bone-breaking violence of the Edo period was incompatible with modern civilized education, right?
Kano was a visionary. He extensively studied two of the most prominent traditional jiu-jitsu schools of his time. He mastered Tenshin Shinryu, which was renowned for its brutal strikes and vital point attacks, and Kido-ryu, which specialized in sophisticated throws and unbalancing the opponent.
He took the raw, lethal source code of those arresting arts and subjected them to a rigorous scientific method. He systematically stripped out the most dangerous techniques, the joint breaking, the eye gouging, the lethal strikes.
Why? Because you cannot practice tearing a rotator cuff at full speed on a resisting partner without sending them to the hospital.
Obviously not.
Kano understood that to truly master the mechanics of unbalancing and throwing, practitioners had to be able to spar against a fully resisting opponent safely, at maximum effort, over and over again.
By removing the lethal jutsu, he created a sport, an educational system. He created Kodokan Judo.
He shifted the focus from jutsu, the pragmatic method of killing or arresting an enemy, to the spiritual and educational path of perfecting the self.
He sanitized the violence for the modern era, but the core DNA of the Edo arresting officer is still beating at the heart of the art.
And it is so deeply embedded, so incredibly practical, that the history literally folds back in on itself.
The sources explicitly note that modern Japanese police recruits, the men and women patrolling the streets of Tokyo today, are still required to learn kendo or Kodokan Judo as part of their academy training.
Because the problem hasn't changed. When law enforcement absolutely needs to subdue a violent, resisting human being without deploying lethal force, the biomechanical solutions discovered by the samurai bureaucrats in the 17th century are still the most effective solutions that exist.
It is a breathtaking historical loop. The Okapiki and the samurai SWAT teams invent the brutal science of torite jutsu with their jit and ropes. Hundreds of years later, Jigoro Kano refines that violence into the educational sport of judo, and today, judo is taught right back to the modern Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department to keep the streets safe.
The evolution of the art is a perfect mirror of the evolution of the society itself.
Let's briefly recap the sheer scale of the historical arc we've navigated in this deep dive.
We began in the mud of the Sengoku period, amidst catastrophic civil war, where heavily armored samurai utilized the grappling of kumiuchi and the dagger thrusts of kogusoku to find the gaps in iron armor and deliver fatal blows.
We watched the establishment of the Tokugawa Shogunate force a massive societal paradigm shift. The warriors became bureaucrats, and the new legal mandate to capture criminals alive forced the battlefield math to evolve into the precise structural violence of Edo police tactics, torite jutsu.
We explored the terrifying defensive engineering of the Torimono Mitsudogu. We saw how the sasumata pinned the neck, how the barbed sodegarami weaponized the kimono sleeve, and how the metal jit served as both a bone-breaking truncheon and a badge of absolute authority.
We unpacked the deeply secretive, highly psychological art of Hojojutsu. We saw how the complex geometry of the knots exploited the respiratory system, and how the color, thickness, and pattern of the ropes functioned as a cruel sociological barcode, visually enforcing the rigid class hierarchy of Edo society.
And finally, we tracked how these desperate survival tactics were preserved in classical schools like Takenuchi-ryu, surviving historical debates about foreign origins before eventually being sanitized, refined, and reverse-engineered into the modern global martial arts of Jujutsu and Judo.
It fundamentally rewrites how you view a martial arts demonstration. The next time you see someone executing a flawless throw on a fat, you aren't just watching physics, you are watching history.
You're watching the survival tactics of a bygone era.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've unpacked today about the true origins of these arts. We often talk about martial arts as a study of human anatomy, a pure study of physics, leverage, momentum, center of gravity, torque, and that is undeniably true. The physical mechanics of the human body are a constant. An elbow bends the exact same way and breaks under the exact same amount of pressure today as it did in the mud of 1532.
But what does change, the variable in the equation, are the laws of a society.
Right. The societal architecture dictates the rules of engagement. I want you to consider how the abstract legal architecture of a culture, specifically a suspect's newly minted legal right to face a magistrate, the strict mandate that a violent criminal must be captured alive for the state's execution grounds, literally dictated the physical architecture of the culture's martial arts.
The shifting law forced the warrior to evolve their physical technology.
It forced a generation of killers to solve an incredibly difficult, almost paradoxical puzzle. How do you completely defeat a lethal enemy, an enemy who is actively trying to sever your head with a sword, without taking their life in return? The brutal, ingenious answers to that legal puzzle gave birth to the joint locks, the pins, the sweeps, and the throws that millions of people practice around the world today for sport and self-defense.
The martial art, in its purest form, is merely a physical reflection of the legal reality of its time.
So the next time you picture that pristine dojo, that quiet spiritual space with the cherry blossoms falling outside, remember that the historical landscape beneath it is incredibly murky. That clean, polished wooden floor wasn't built on a foundation of peaceful meditation. It was built directly on top of the muddy, violently brilliant, and terrifyingly precise tactics of the Edo execution grounds.
It is a dark but immensely powerful legacy.
It truly is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.